after 10 o'clock tonight. Right now, we want to talk prenups and whether or not you need one, whether or not you have one, and also address the question, if both people have debts entering a relationship, do they need a prenup? Joining us to talk about this is Diana Isaac. She's a lawyer at the Shulman law firm. Hi, Diana. Thanks a lot for doing this.
Hi, Barb. Thank you for having me on your show.
Is it true that more people lately are getting into the prenup idea?
In my experience, it's becoming a lot more prevalent. I mean, prenuptial agreements, which are referred to as marriage contracts in Canada, are entered into for various reasons. So with almost half of Canadian marriages ending in divorce, a marriage contract can help individuals emerge from their marital breakdown essentially financially unscathed. So if you take, for instance, CIBC, their 2016 couples finances poll showed that two-thirds, imagine that, Barb, two-thirds of those who plan to marry or live even in common law are entering into their relationship in debt. So for those that have very little assets, they have money that they want to set aside, they may not want to divide that. And this is their way of maintaining their financial integrity.
Oh, so in other words, if two people are getting married and one has a lot of debt, the other one's saying, I want a prenup because I don't want that debt to become mine?
Well, yeah, what happens with the marriage contract is debts can be carved out, just like you're carving out certain assets that you don't want to be divided in property. So you can stipulate how you want certain assets and debts to be treated through a marriage contract.
What about if people are not getting married at that point, but they're just planning on living together? Can they still do some kind of contract to make financial arrangements?
Yes, so there are people that enter into cohabitation agreements, and if they decide to become married, those become marriage contracts.
Okay, so but the cohabitation agreement, does that stand if they are living together long enough that it then is considered common law?
Yes, so what happens is that too also works with, again, carving out the debts and the assets that you want to exclude or not have divided. But in situations where we have common law partners, we're not looking at the traditional way of dividing properties, what we call, which is a complicated formula, equalization of net family property. But in a way, you want to be maintaining, for instance, there are parties that don't want to be in a position to risk their business interests that they've worked to vigorously develop. Mm-hmm. Or let's say, I see more and more people that are young professionals who start earning large salaries early in their careers, and they're concerned about their support obligations to their spouse that still could be in a common law predicament.
What about, I was going to say older couples, but I don't really mean older couples. I mean people who are on their second marriage and perhaps bringing a little more to the marriage in terms of what they have. It could be a house, it could be some money. Are the prenups more common in second marriages?
I mean, absolutely. I find more and more with what we call gray divorces, we have older couples entering into their second marriage with assets. So I find that they tend to feel compelled to protect anything salvaged from, let's say, divorce number one. And what they don't want to do is risk their children's future inheritance, because the money they're getting from their initial relationship is flowing to the second relationship, and they want to preclude this new spouse from taking that away from their children.
What are some of the main reasons that a couple would look to get a prenup?
There's various reasons. Number one, I see a lot of people that want to protect their business interests. People that, again, are earning large incomes in their careers at a very young age. They also want to be able to protect that. Older couples entering into the second marriage. These are the typical ones that I see in my practice.
You know, we often hear stories, and usually when it comes to celebrities, about people challenging the prenups. Are most prenuptial agreements enforceable, or does it depend on who puts it together for you?
Excellent question. I think it's very, very important to know that, a marriage contract is subject to being challenged and set aside. And a couple of the reasons could be, for instance, one side failed to disclose significant assets or debts or other liabilities. And so they come to me and they say, Diana, I don't want to disclose this information. And what I say to them is essentially what they're doing is placing their marriage contract at the mercy of any future challenge. And I wouldn't be signing a marriage contract without full and accurate disclosure. Also, if one doesn't understand the nature of the marriage contract or the consequences, this is why we always impress upon people to get independent legal advice before entering into this contract. And also, for reasons of fraud or duress or undue influence, that too, you can challenge and set aside a marriage contract if that's found. So this is one of the reasons, Barb, we don't recommend that parties try to negotiate a marriage contract on, let's say, the eve of their wedding. Firstly, I don't think it actually makes for a very happy honeymoon that's fast approaching. Mm-hmm. But quite importantly, we don't want to see a power imbalance with the parties. So, you know, couples have invested in significant funds for their wedding. They've invited hundreds of guests. We have a bridal party at times. So this doesn't really put the party in a fair position to make an informed decision about the marriage contract when their wedding is, let's say, the next day. So we want to be very cognizant of the fact that we need a reasonable time frame to have these contracts put together in order to avoid any potential challenge.
Sure, because could that be down the road, somebody saying, well, I signed it under duress?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's actually one of the reasons that you can't set aside. Yeah.
And when I mentioned earlier that I was going to be having you on to talk about prenups, and I said I personally don't know anybody who has a prenup, and I was wondering if any of our listeners do, or maybe they have themselves. Somebody texted in and said to me, maybe people have prenups, but they're too embarrassed to say it. Is there still a stigma around having a prenuptial agreement?
I think there can be. A lot of people are, they say, you know, I always get this interesting question that's frequently asked about, you know, does the marriage contract increase the chance of a divorce? Mm-hmm. And they're afraid of that. And my response is that just because someone has a marriage contract, it doesn't mean that their marriage is not going to last. I think it means that the person is being pragmatic and reasonable and to a certain extent responsible.
Some people might think it shows lack of faith in the upcoming relationship.
I mean, I think that if you look at it in the sense of being very proactive and maybe avoiding future acrimony if there is a separation, then it's an if and will type of situation that you want to avoid. I mean, you don't have to necessarily presume that it's going to be the end of it, but I think it's a very mature way of looking at things and to probably avoid further conflict if there is a breakdown.
Diana, interesting stuff. Thank you so much for this.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure.
Diana Isaac, lawyer at Shulman Law Firm. Is it too personal a question if I ask you about prenuptial agreements? And you don't have to answer on behalf of yourself if you know someone. I'm just curious because I don't know anyone who has a prenuptial agreement. And I'm probably thinking of people, most of the people I know who got married, you know, in their 20s and they're still in the same marriage. And I wonder, I would think it may become a little more of an issue if you're looking at getting married for the second time. Would you ever consider signing a prenuptial agreement? Do you think it shows a lack of faith in a relationship? Or are you someone who wishes you had signed a prenuptial agreement, but you didn't because you believed it was going to last forever? 416-872-1010. Text us at 71010. Curious to hear if anybody knows of anybody with a prenuptial agreement. I don't think there's any stigma around it anymore, especially if you go into the marriage with a high-paying job or a house. I think it's just smart to go ahead and do that. 416-872-1010. You're listening to The Night Side. It's 9:16. NewsTalk 1010, Time Saver Traffic.